I'm an assistant professor at Temple University. We have the last session of the conference on electronic health records and health information exchange. We have 4 exciting presentations lined up. Similar to the previous session, we're going to have a 7-minute presentation, and then at the end of the session, we're going to open up the floor for questions for 10 minutes. First up, we have Dory Cross from University of Michigan.
Thanks, Jeff. Thank you all so much for sticking around last session of the day. I'm really excited to share some work that I've been doing with my advisor, my primary advisor, Julia Adler-Milstein at University of Michigan. And we're looking at health information exchange and electronic information sharing between hospitals and the post-acute care setting. Long-term and post-acute care all kind of used interchangeably. So I wanted to start with just some kind of motivation behind why we wanted to take a look at this. So transitions between hospitals and long-term care settings is increasingly at the top of the mind for policymakers. We know there are either transitions that occur frequently. There are some really serious documented deficits in the quality and safety of handoffs when patients are being discharged from hospitals to long-term post-acute care settings. And it's really coming down to an issue where there's a lack of communication and a lack of robust information sharing between these two settings. And so similar to what we see in terms of information sharing electronically between hospitals and ambulatory care providers, primary care providers, specialists, et cetera, is health information exchange also the answer for improving information sharing between hospitals and post-acute care settings? And so we see some, mixed but generally positive evidence that HIE has some benefit for improving care when patients are being discharged back to the community, but we're hesitant when we think about translating that evidence to the hospital post-acute care transition because those transitions are different. So we really need some more evidence in this space to think about what are the specific needs in the hospital post-acute care transitions, what's happening in terms of health information exchange, what's motivating that behavior. So specifically trying to get some national estimates of this activity and where it's happening, and then what's motivating it. So specifically, is it the IT characteristics of the hospitals themselves? They're investing in transitions to the community, and so they're also investing in transitions to post-acute care. Is it more motivated by complementary policy action where we're focused on readmissions and changes to prospective payment to skilled nursing facilities to try to improve these transitions and patient bounce back between the hospital and the post-acute care setting? So what is it that's getting hospitals and long-term care providers to invest in these relationships with electronic information sharing? So this first analysis that we did was looking at combining 3 different sources of data. So we used Hospital Association survey data, both the main survey as well as the IT supplement, to actually identify hospitals who say, yes, we are exchanging information electronically with long-term care providers. And then combining that with some publicly available data from CMS on level of engagement in other policy initiatives. So are these hospitals engaged in accountable care organizations? Are they engaged in bundled payments? These other initiatives that we think might be leading hospitals to be thinking about and strategically investing in post-acute care transitions broadly, and perhaps also with electronic information sharing. So we conducted some multivariate logistic regression trying to look at what are the effects of these different motivators on presence of electronic information sharing. And the numbers are a little small, but you can see just in terms of basic descriptive statistics, about half of the 2,000 hospitals in this survey did say, yes, we are exchanging information electronically with long-term care settings. So you can see about a third are saying, yes, we only send, and about 23% are saying we actually engage in bidirectional exchange. So we send and we also receive information electronically. And just as a quick aside to that, the bidirectional exchange is really interesting for a number of reasons, but when we think about that long-term care providers were not included in the meaningful use program, the fact that this IT adoption is still progressing in spite of the lack of incentives is important. So let me quickly walk through the main results. So we ran all of these different characteristics looking at, is there any electronic information exchange happening? And then specifically looking at the predictors of this bidirectional exchange. Because when we think about how are we going to improve care continuity, how are we going to improve the integration of care across the spectrum, the information really needs to be flowing in both directions. And so you can see we looked at both general IT characteristics as well as these specific policy motivators. And you can see that all of the IT characteristics we looked at on the hospital side are positively associated with the hospital exchanging in long-term care. So we kind of see this, rising tide lifts all ships. As hospitals invest in their IT capabilities, even though they aren't directly being motivated to invest in electronic information sharing with long-term care providers, there might be some spillover there. While we're already investing in sending information to primary care providers, we're also going to invest in sharing information with long-term care. When you look at the policy motivators, you can see slightly less significance, but it is trending towards showing that as hospitals participate in bundled payments, as they participate in ACOs, they have a slightly higher odds of doing electronic information exchange. And when we look at the bottom of the slide, significantly, hospitals that either own, affiliate, or joint venture with a SNF, so an indication of a stronger organizational affiliation, they're more likely to be exchanging information electronically. So as healthcare systems continue to integrate and consolidate and include that post-acute care setting, we can expect that electronic information exchange between those settings is likely to increase. So just really quickly with my 30 seconds that I still have, we see some evidence, over half of hospitals reported that they were engaged in some form of electronic information sharing with hospitals. So that is positive in the absence of really strong financial incentives. It's good to see that behavior has already started. But then when we think about, in terms of policy implications, where does that leave us? Where should we be targeting resources to make sure that this broad bidirectional exchange is happening across the board? And when we think about, ACOs and bundled payments, the more that we invest in getting providers to collaborate across organizational settings and really aligning those incentives, that's also going to push electronic information sharing, and not just the presence of it, but the specifics of making that information sharing more meaningful for providers on both sides. So, thank you.
Next, we have Jay Holmgren, also
AJ.
from University. AJ Holmgren,
Yep.
sorry, also from University of Michigan.
Hi everyone, like I said, I'm AJ Holmgren. I'm a master's student at the University of Michigan, and this is some work that I've done with my advisor, Julia Adler-Milstein, as well as the illustrious Jeff McCullough. And we're going to talk about EHR ability to enable high performance of hospitals on stage 2 meaningful use criteria. So to kind of give a background here, we have the ONC certification program, which effectively tells us any EHR that has been certified by this program will allow a hospital to meet the stage 2 meaningful use criteria. But I think there's also a sense that there is value in going above the minimum criteria. There is additional value in generating the rest of your patient's summary of care records and being able to send them electronically beyond what is specified by stage 2 meaningful use. There is value in having patients being able to view, download, and transmit their health data beyond just the 5% that you have to do to get stage 2 meaningful use money. So what we looked at was whether EHR vendor choice is impactful upon hospital meaningful use criteria performance, whether those effects are consistent across several different meaningful use criteria, and how much of that performance variation is explained by hospital vendor choice as compared to other hospital characteristics. We used a couple of different data sources for this. Our primary one was the ONC's Certified Health IT Product List. which we also then use the CMS meaningful use attestation public use file in order to derive our dependent variable, which would be hospital performance on those meaningful use criteria. And then the AHA annual survey and the IT supplement, which give us hospital controls and various hospital characteristics. We performed some regression analysis based on vendor performance in the stage 2 meaningful use criteria. And since we were concerned that there might be some endogeneity issues, as in we were really measuring just good hospitals pick good vendors, we used an instrumental variable strategy that would be a little bit too long to get into in 5 minutes, but I'm happy to answer questions about it or talk offline. So the first thing we looked at was kind of amongst hospitals who are in the top quartile of each of these different stage 2 meaningful use criteria, what is the market share of vendors in those top quartile high-performing hospitals? So we can see on the left there, in terms of CPOE for medication, when we looked at the 5 biggest players by market share, by total market share, which were Epic, Cerner, Meditech, McKesson, and MedHost. So we can see in CPOE for medication, in terms of view, download, transmit available, and VDTUs, those first 3 criteria, Epic is significantly overrepresented in hospitals who are in the top quartile of those criteria. We also see Cerner is pretty high up there, but other than that, they're pretty spread apart. In the next 3, which are a little more difficult criteria, medication reconciliation, and then sort of the health information exchange ones, which include summary of care records provided and then summary of care records sent electronically, there's a little bit more of a diversification amongst EHR vendors who are represented in those top quartile high-performing hospitals, but it still see a large presence with Epic and Cerner. The biggest outlier would be generation of summary of care records. So we also performed some regression analysis, and these also are just the vendors from that, and they include the standard set of hospital controls, such as size, ownership, various other critical access status, real participation, teaching status. And we see a kind of similar story. We're seeing Epic is positive and significant across the board of those 6 stage 2 meaningful use criteria, except for summary of care records created. Cerner is a similar story, but perhaps less so, and they also have a negative association with summary of care records created, whereas Epic is pretty much at 0 and not significant. And then after that, we're looking at Meditech, McKesson, and MedHost. They're sort of all over the board. They have a few positive associations with higher performance and a few negative associations with lower performance. So we're kind of seeing a pretty clear storyline emerging where Epic and Cerner are the kind of 2 intuitively sense big players in the game who really seem to be the ones who are really supplying EHR vendors or EHRs to hospitals who we associate with high performance, are kind of, we're seeing that play out in a very similar story to what the graph showed in terms of market share amongst high performing top quartile hospitals. So, all right, we're all prepared to be hospital CIOs. Just open the checkbook, write a nice check to Madison, Wisconsin, and we've got Epic and we're all ready to go. But not quite. So taking a look at the partial R squared from regressions, our last question that we wanted to tackle was how much does this actually matter? So we're saying that Epic will enable you to get some high performance on your stage 2 meaningful use criteria, but how much of that is Epic in comparison to, how tech savvy your workforce is, how big of a, some sort of IT department you have, and how young your doctors are, and how good they are at interacting with the EHR. So we see depending on the criteria, it's between 7 and 33%. And this is even controlling for observable hospital characteristics such as size, teaching status, urban versus rural. So we can see that really it's more about what hospitals do and how they use that technology than which one they pick. There's definitely a clear outlier of the Epic and Cerners of the world, the ones who sort of deliver us that high technology that enables high performance, but there's clearly a much bigger emphasis on how the hospitals use that technology than which software you pick. So in conclusion, some vendors are more consistently used in those high-performing hospitals, and we do see that across the criteria, the less so in summary of care records created. Second is that Epic is consistently good, and other vendors are more variable. Cerner is very close, but they do have that negative associated with summary of care record created. Epic is consistently good across all 6 of the criteria that we looked at, and that while EHR vendor choice does matter, what matters a lot more, in fact, is how your organization implements that technology and uses that technology. All right.
All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Just a clarification, so this research is not sponsored by Epic?
No, it's in fact not. If there's any EHR vendors in the room, I'm very sorry. Unless you work for Epic, in which case.
All right, our next presenter is Yunfeng Shi from Pennsylvania State University.
Yeah, do I get 1 minute he left? Okay. Yeah, I just want to say one thing first. I once presented in the very last panel of a conference, and it's sufficient to say that the size, we had a 4-person panel too, and the size of the audience is smaller than the panel. So, so when I say this, believe me, I really appreciate all of you being here. So I'm going to talk about patient experience and electronic health records. Right? So this is mostly a work with a doctoral student who just graduated this summer, Veronica, and she's now at the University of Chile, and along with a bunch of colleagues at Penn State University. Okay. So why do we want to do this? And so there has been a huge movement of patient-centered care. Now, even now, I think there is some vagueness in terms of the definition of what is patient-centered care. But I think we can all agree that patient experience is an important part of that. Okay. And so just to give you an example, in the hospital value-based purchasing program, now 30% of the performance score come from patient experience measures. So that's the importance of this. And in terms of the impact of electronic health records on the quality of care, I think for this audience, and especially considering Jeff is still there, I'm just going to say that the evidence is mixed. I'm not going to say any more about that. Right? But I do want to mention one particular study because that serves as a very interesting comparison and a benchmark of our study. So Apri et al., they published a paper in Health Services Research in 2012. And here is what they did. And it's pretty straightforward. Right? They matched HIMSS data, the electronic health records adoption, and they mapped that into 4 levels, or actually 5 levels of EHR capabilities, and they used that as a proxy for meaningful use. Now, I don't think they actually measure meaningful use, and neither do we, but that sort of served as a proxy. And they linked that data to Hospital Compare, and they looked at 4 different conditions of care. I think that's think about that's pneumonia, surgical infection, heart failure, and AMI. So they looked at those 4 conditions, and they looked at the care, the quality of the process of care. Okay. And what they found is the following. So the model is straightforward, basic econometrics. At the hospital level, fixed effects. Year fixed effects, nothing else. That's it. And they used the data from 2006 and 2010. So that's the study period. And given that fixed effects model, what they found is that when hospitals switch from the lower level to level 3, and I'm going to explain that a little bit later. Okay? And there is an increase in those process of care. There's an improvement of those process of care. But when hospitals switch from level 3 to level 4, there is actually a significant decrease in the quality of care in terms of those processes. Okay. The magnitude of the finding is somewhere between half percentage point to a little bit more than 1 percentage point. Okay. So is that large effect? Well, I think people have different perspectives. Okay. So that's the sort of the motivation for our study. So when I read that paper, I think, well, you know what? We've looked at the process of care. Why don't we look at the patient experience? Because ultimately, if the process of care improved and if the care improved, you should have better clinic outcome and you should have better patient experience. So that's the main motivation. And what we did here is also basic, straightforward econometrics, a little bit more than what they did, but not too much more. Okay? So we used slightly more recent data. We matched HCAHPS data, the patient experience component of HCAHPS, to the HIMSS data. And we, just following that paper, we used 1 year lag. So the dependent variable is 1 year ahead of the EHR capabilities. And we also used the area resource file to calculate some of the market characteristics. So, and the outcomes that we look at are the domain scores from HCAHPS of patient experience. I'm going to give you the list later. And the main explanatory variables are the EHR capabilities. But in addition to that, in our analysis, we include the duration that each hospital spent on a particular level of EHR. And we include the usual suspects of the control variables. So I'm not going to, given the timing, I'm not going to do more than that. So those are the 5 levels of EHR capabilities that we use, and they serve as the proxy for meaningful use. So basically, you need to have 3 essential components to be at level 1. If you don't have all 3 of them, you're going to be at level 0, and then you add on to those. So when you get to CDS, it's level 2, and when you add a medical when we add a medication administration record, it's level 3. And finally, if you have CPOE, it's going to be level 4. And in terms of the outcomes, those are the 10 different components that we look at. Communications with doctors, communications with nurses, blah, blah, blah. And then we also have several dimensions that I don't expect them to show any effects. And I think it's sort of interesting to see how they play out. So for example, hospital, whether the hospital is clean, whether the hospital is quiet, I really don't expect that to be related to EHR. Okay. So the approach, also straightforward, basic, fixed effects, hospital level fixed effects, year fixed effects, but in addition, we also include the linear hospital-specific trend, just to control for the national and the hospital level trend. So in addition to the regular fixed effects, we include that. And also we did a robustness test just to see if there is a propensity to switch and that affect our results. So we include an indicator the year before you switch to level 4. So those are the robustness tests that we did. And we cluster our standard errors, and we also did a subsample analysis of the hospitals that are at the bottom quartile of the patient experience score to start with. Okay. So here are our findings. We found very similar magnitude of effects, and they're basically half percentage points. And but you could look at them as they are. Relative to the baseline, they're close to 1 percentage points. And relative to the main average movement of the patient experience score, they're about 5 to 7%. So again, whether the size is big, it depends on perspective. So that's we found. And I think the one interesting thing I want to mention last is that in their findings, that when you switch to level 4, you see some decrease in the quality. In our case, actually, all the improvement comes from switching to level 4. Okay. So thank you.
And our last presenter is Idris Adjerit from University of Notre Dame.
Okay, so this is a work jointly with Corey Yanks from Notre Dame and Ralph Gross from Carnegie Mellon, and also he's a chief innovation technology officer at Disruptive Robotics. And actually, the motivation for this work actually starts from a funny place. So I came to White 7 years ago, and I heard Ritu and Gordon and Jeff talk, and I drank their Kool-Aid, and I said, EHR is the best thing since sliced bread. It's going to change the world. And I believed that for a long time. And I started reading some articles. I started getting some other perspectives. And there's some pretty critical people of EHR out there, right? And these are in some big places. So you have talking a lot about the way that EHR can limit innovation, the way that EHR can force physicians into certain workflows. Right? And I'm picking like the nice things from these papers. I mean, these guys really go to town. And I kind of had this moment of truth, and maybe like a lot of us do in this field, and said, well, do I still believe this? And I think I do. I think my optimism has remained. And the reason is that, in fact, the optimism was spurred on by the last year's White, where we talked about this idea of whether EHR is the end-all for health IT, or is it the starting point, right? Is it a platform upon which we innovate, or is it this fix-all solution that's going to just solve all healthcare problems? And I think clearly it's probably the first, right? It's probably the former. And what that means is that, when you look at these papers, they say, well, there's going to be all these gaps in terms of what EHRs can offer. And the question is, how do we fill them, right? How do we kind of grab those morsels of value that kind of sit on the wayside here? And effectively, our argument or our kind of conjecture is one way to do it is to develop really lightweight, targeted applications in the context of healthcare that can kind of, fill some of these very specific needs that seem to be kind of ignored because of all these competitive and other reasons around how to develop these large enterprise systems. To make it a little bit more concrete, we're actually focusing on, this is related to Sriram's, what Sriram presented earlier today about the ED and this problem of how do we facilitate the flow of patients from the emergency room into the inpatient units. And if you look at, we've actually seen this in quite a few hospitals, this is a functionality that's critical. These handoffs can be correlated, poor handoffs, poor transition to patients are correlated with poor outcomes, more cost, less profit, all kinds of negative things. Yet we're still managing this process in many places via like an ad hoc process. There's some person, a dedicated nurse, whose job is to facilitate the flow of patients. So we look at this iOS app that basically enables this flow of information between the ED nursing and staff to the inpatient nurses and staff. And it effectively allows them, on the ED side, it generates this list of patients that are in your care at the time. And it actually sorts them via some algorithm of sorts. And then it also allows you to communicate with the inpatient unit in potentially, a more efficient way to facilitate this handoff. So it's a pretty simple functionality, but it's also a gap that tends to exist. Even this hospital has an advanced EHR system, right? So just to give you an idea of what this looks like, on the inpatient side, you might have these things coming in, and these things are on, this app is run on iPads, it's run on iPod touches, a few iOS devices in the hospital, and you just have basically this managing of this process. You send a soft request to the inpatient unit nurse sees it, sends you a soft approval, and so on and so forth, and then eventually you're assigning a bed via this app, and then the ED says, okay, we have a bed and we can send the patient, right? So again, a pretty simple process, but the question is really, can we actually estimate the effect of this app? So ultimately, is there a main effect? So something this simple in a very complicated dynamic environment, is it going to actually generate value? So the first thing, we have data from 67 months in a community-sized acute care hospital in Pennsylvania. We have 170,000 patient visits in this data, about 63,000 unique patients. And we estimate the model that everyone's seen in a way. It's a standard fixed effects model, controls fixed effects for people and time and the unit that the person is admitted into or not. So the first thing we look at is the main effect, and then we also think about, can such a simple app handle complex handoffs? How does the effect, if there's any, on efficiency, moderated by the simplicity or the complexity of the handoff? And are there kind of this maturity effect, pre and post pilot phases in this case? So this app was rolled out over 9 months across 4 different units in a staggered fashion. We consider that the pilot period, and then we consider the post kind of rollout, the maturity period, right? So we look at these effects, and the short answer, and I don't usually present results in this way, probably for good reason. I don't know why I did it today, but the short answer is that there is a main effect over the course of this period, about a 3.4% reduction in length of stay in the ED after the app is introduced. But this nuance is interesting. So it turns out that if you look at complexity, the app seems to be creating the most value for non-complex trade-offs. And I don't have enough time to get into how we define that, but I'm happy to talk about it. But actually increases length of stay for complex trade-offs, right? So you're talking about potentially some efficiency loss. But we disentangle this a bit more, so we look at maturity. And what we see is, again, most of this value is being accrued post kind of the rollout. So once it's adopted across all the hospital units, you see almost an 8.3% reduction in length of stay. And that's a big number for EDs. They care a lot about that kind of a number. But before, you're seeing this loss in efficiency, a 3.7% increase in length of stay in this kind of initial rollout period. And then we estimate kind of this full model where we tease all the effects apart. I think it tells kind of this story. So in the premature, in the rollout period, in the prematurity, we actually only see inefficiency, right? But it's driven by the complex cases. So the app used results in about 1.8% increase in length of stay, not significant, but a 4.4% increase in length of stay for complex handoffs. In the maturity period, we actually see kind of that, it kind of comes back and it shows that for the simple handoffs, once the units have gotten used to using this app, a 7.3% reduction in the length of stay, and even a slight but insignificant reduction in the complex cases. So we think that, it's interesting that even though it's fairly simple and targeted, it actually exhibits some of the same dynamics we see around, more general health IT implementations with moderated effects by complexity of kind of the instance and also by the maturity of the technology itself. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, we can get some questions for our presenters.
Just have a very quick question from you, you mentioned that you also have some kind of a placebo test, right, for those kind of cleanness or quietness, right, of the hospital. So what are the results?
Yeah, actually, that provides some face validity. Those outcomes are not significant. We do not find
Not
any impact
significant
on
at
those.
all.
Yeah,
I see.
not
Okay,
significant
cool.
at all.
Thanks.
Yeah.
I have a quick question for Idris. So thank you for your comment about how, EHRs can be used as a platform for health innovation. In thinking about that, as we innovate and develop new apps that can improve the EHR experience, so when we read about like how different hospitals implemented EHRs, we learned about how they had to roll out in very specific ways that were organizationally dependent because of different cultures, right? Are you noticing, I don't know if you have experience with this, but are you noticing that when you, like with the Blueview app, is there a cultural acceptance towards these apps on EHRs in places that already have EHRs, or is there some resistance to the new technology that we're adding onto it?
Our experience is that the staff is actually very receptive to these apps, and the reason is that they're so much more customizable to their workflows than some of the EHR functionality. There's the usual kind of aversion to new technology. You have to learn it, you have to do those kind of things. But in general, our view, the overall sentiment is fairly positive, especially in light of fairly rigid functionality offered by EHRs that is very difficult to customize.
Thank you.
Quick question to follow up with that, Idris. So, hello. Yeah. So often the rollout of apps is concurrent to other process changes in the hospital or rollouts of other technology. So, do you think that that might be one of the driving factors why you would expect the app to change behaviors?
Yeah. So I think this is kind of one of the trade-offs between these like national sample studies and one hospital study. We have a pretty intimate awareness of the things that are happening in the hospital during this time period. It's a fairly small space. So we don't know of any other operational initiatives that were happening at the time that this app was rolled out. In fact, we actually control for some of the staff changes that we saw. The head of the ED was, for example, replaced with another person, so we have a control for that. So we have a lot of knowledge about our context. The issue, of course, is sometimes that data is less generalizable than some of the national stuff, but we do see some of that and try to control for what we know.
Okay. Similar to, kind of following up on the previous question to AJ, you didn't have time to discuss your instrument. So is there an indigeneity concern? How do you address it? Can you discuss your IV?
Sure. So the instrument that we used was hospitals in your region that are not part of the same healthcare system as you using the same EHR. And we kind of picked that because we figured that would be correlated with vendor choice, as we know different EHR vendors market differently in different regions, and that there are some vendor dominance effects among different regions. So hospitals in between, not your immediate neighbors, but within that market, so 15 to 50 miles, using that same EHR as you, and that should be correlated to vendor choice, but not to your performance on meaningful use. And we used it as basically a robustness check, and we found very similar results with our OLS.
And I also had a question. So you mentioned that it is not just the power of Epic, it is also the power of the hospitals, that they are having this kind of stuff and so on and so forth. My question is that, is this the power of Epic, that Epic is targeting special kind of hospitals that like they are selling their product to good hospitals rather than like other companies, something like that?
Yeah, and that's a really hard one to disentangle because the Epic does have a sales strategy that really has them going out and selling to hospitals that tend to be high performers in other characteristics as well. And so, using the instrumental variable strategy is kind of our best way to go about that. But I do think that there is probably likely some effect of the way that Epic markets their product and who they choose to allow to use their software, in that's where we see a little bit of the association. So we try to disentangle that by using instrumental variables, and we see a very similar set of results. But nothing is a perfect strategy.
Any more questions? I actually had one for Dory. So I was wondering if there's something special about the information exchange between hospitals and the long-term care facilities. So in some sense, is it any different than two hospitals sharing information, or do you expect to find similar things if you had your study just, just among the hospitals? So I was wondering if they share more information because maybe they have less competition among them, or data blocking, or does that have any implications for your results, you think?
Sure. So that's a great question. And I do think that information sharing between hospitals and post-acute care settings is different than looking at between hospitals or between hospitals and community providers. There has been, some research already that the goals and thus the information needs of those two settings are quite different. So a hospital is an acute care setting, a skilled nursing facility or other long-term care providers that are focused on post-acute care are more focused on functional status and tracking, improvement in activities of daily living and rehabilitation. And so, when we think about can we translate the evidence from information exchange between hospitals and community providers to the hospital to post-acute care space, they're different in a lot of ways because the information needs are so different as a patient transitions from a hospital to a post-acute care setting. And so then you have all of these additional challenges of how do you design meaningful information exchange between two settings when the information that they need and the information that they use are quite different. And so do you the hospital might not be sending information because they don't think it's relevant. They might not even be collecting the information that the post-acute care setting would actually really need to better care for a patient.
Question to Dory. For those of us who wants to use a meaningful use, public use files, there's a difference there are some differences between stage 1 variables and stage 2 variables. And there's some modification at some point of what each of those measures are. So how do you operationalize, maybe this is a detailed question, but how do you operationalize going about using different stage variables?
It's a really good question. So we looked at stage 1 only versus stage 2 of meaningful use to try to capture as the requirements ramp up for increasing the percentage of summary of care records sent electronically. Does that further encourage electronic information sharing and information exchange with outside providers? And so, capturing, if you've only achieved stage 1 at this point, this was in 2014, you're a more limited user than if you've met the requirements for stage 2. But that's actually something that we're exploring more as we try to extend this work and tie it to outcomes, is thinking about not just a binary measure of do you exchange, do you not, but using the actual publicly the meaningful use files and trying to understand level of exchange and really trying to get at how much is this activity really taking place rather than a self-report of oh yeah we do bidirectional exchange. So I'm not sure if that really answers your question, but it's something we're struggling with as well.
Okay, I think we're out of time for our session, and we can take further questions offline. And let's give a final round of applause for all the presenters.
At this time, I'll ask the conference chairs to come up and say some closing remarks.
I just want to, so my closing remarks are, I really appreciate everyone coming. I think this is a fantastic conference. I learned new things and saw a lot of interesting work and met great people. But most importantly, see you next year.
I want to add one more that I learned Jeff's birthday as well. So fantastic. Thank you very much for coming.
I thought you hadn't seen enough PowerPoints in the last day and a half, so I figured I'd put together a quick PowerPoint presentation for my closing remarks. So what did I learn? I think my first takeaway from the conference is that I'm going to rename it henceforth. This is no longer white, but it's the Idris Acharit workshop, and pretty soon we'll send around a little survey to see how many of you like this new name for white. All right, I learned a lot over the last day and a half, and as I was thinking and sitting in the last session and preparing my PowerPoint slides at the very last minute, I said, well, how about we collectively develop a topics hype curve, right? Everybody's familiar with the Gartner hype curve, and it usually applies to a single technology, but I thought we might sort of take the same idea and apply it to the topics that we've heard over the last 36 hours. So tell me, any guesses as to what might be at the bottom left over there, and I'll share mine with you. Bottom left, at the beginning of the curve. Obama. What? Obama. Come on. All right, so I put wearables right down there, right? I mean, I think this is a technology that's just sort of starting to come to fruition, and we're starting to see some early research in this area. What do we have on the peak of inflated? What do we have in the peak of inflated expectations? Any guesses? All right, machine learning's hot. Machine learning is hot. We saw that. A lot of presentations on data mining, machine learning. Lots and lots of new data sets available. And of course, everybody's going at it with a hammer and a chisel to figure out who can build the best predictive model. But this is a very exciting area of growth. Trough of disillusionment. To my surprise, I heard yesterday that patient engagement is not the best thing since sliced bread. I put a question mark after it because I'm not fully persuaded by that gentleman's argument, but it's something that we ought to keep at the back of our minds anyway. Can we develop the evidence to show that patient engagement works and under what conditions that works? Slope of enlightenment. Any guesses? Transparency in healthcare. I think we've gathered a lot of evidence to show that transparency in healthcare is important and that it works. So all of the work on quality transparency and cost transparency is finally developing, I think, a pretty compelling body of evidence. And the last one, plateau of productivity, which I think is very apropos of the last presentation that Idris made, which is now EHRs are sort of the infrastructure upon which you start building forward. And I promise I did my presentation before he got up here and started talking. All right, so that's my takeaway from a set of takeaways from White. And once again, thank you all very much. Happy travels.
So thanks everyone, and just want to remind everybody to please complete your conference evaluations. That's going to be emailed out here in just a minute. It'll also have a link to all the slides and the abstracts. The abstracts are posted. The slides will be posted early next week. If you don't want your slides posted, just send us an email, let us know. But other than that, thanks again, safe travels, and I hope to see you next year.